Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. There is about 100 days until the 2024 presidential election, and earlier this week we saw a major shakeup in the race, with President Joe Biden announcing that he is dropping out and endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, to be the candidate for the Democratic Party. Here to explain what this moment in political history means and the messaging around it is a top political strategist and a CEO of a communications firm, Doug Thornell. He leads SKDK, and he has done work with the DNC, the DCCC, Governor Wes Moore, and Senator Mark Kelly. Doug, thank you so much for being here.
Maggie, it's great to be with you.
So I want to start with kind of a broad question, but there's so much news and there are so many talking heads talking about what Kamala Harris, the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party now, should be doing about her messaging. So what are you hearing in your world about the Harris campaign and the messaging she has and the messaging that she needs to put out there?
It's a great question. Today, she just launched her first campaign video, soundtrack by Beyonce, with freedom being kind of the overarching theme. And I think you're going to hear a lot about freedom as a theme. I think you're going to hear a lot about unity versus division. And I think you're going to hear a lot about the future and moving the party forward and not going backwards. And talking straight to working class Americans about what it would mean to live under a President Trump presidency, where Social Security and Medicare would be on the chopping block, Department of Education would be eliminated, prescription drug prices would be increased, child care would be cut, versus the agenda that the vice president is going to push, which is one where opportunity is going to be available to all Americans, regardless of where you live. And I think those are going to be the themes you hear over the next couple weeks and probably heading into the convention.
Now, obviously, Vice President Harris effectively stepped into the campaign apparatus that had been built by President Joe Biden. As a communications expert, as a political strategist, Doug, what do you think of her decision to basically inherit that operation and keep it as it is versus building one of her own?
Very smart. To build a presidential campaign, it takes months, and so this was, her campaign. She was not at the top of the ticket, but it was the Biden-Harris campaign. I think the fact that now she can inherit a lot of the infrastructure, I expect her to bring on more people in terms of, sort of being additive there. But I think it gives her a lot of advantages in terms of being able to go, right? So she's not really having to build the car as she's driving it. The car's been built. I expect her to add things here and there, but it gives her a real, a real opportunity to, just fight this out, and both from an infrastructure, staff, and a money standpoint. So all of the money that was raised by the Biden-Harris campaign now goes to Kamala Harris. And so that's super helpful. The volunteer network, all of these things that have been worked on by the Biden-Harris operation for the last, year and a half are now, in motion. So the continuity piece is really important.
You talk about the money, and there is, of course, the $81 million that was raised by the campaign, by small donors in the first 24 hours after Biden dropped out of the race. It's really feeling like momentum has shifted. But I'm wondering, Doug, what is your perspective on Vice President Harris's strengths and weaknesses from the messaging standpoint? You kind of talked about the differences between the two candidates and what they'll be talking about. But where is she especially strong, and where is she struggling?
I think she's tough, and I think that will come through her prosecutor background, being able to talk about, the prosecutor versus felon contrast, which I think is something you're going to hear more and more about. That's going to be, I think, a real core theme of what she's going to be talking about. And I think also the fact that, she has foreign policy experience, having been vice president. I think she can connect with a lot of different groups, demographics, types of voters out there. So those are all strengths. I don't really look. It's hard to say weaknesses. I think I would say, look, when you're the vice president, you've spent 3.5 years talking about and promoting the president, right? So I think transitioning to talking about herself and talking about her record is going to be something that obviously has to happen. And I think you'll see her get more and more comfortable with it. But I imagine that's going to be a bit of a change, right? I mean, for the whole campaign, she's been talking about Joe Biden, what he's done as president, what he will do as president. And now that changed in a matter of days. And so now it's all about her talking about her vision and what she's going to do. And so, that's going to take a little bit of an adjustment. But from everything I've seen in the last, 3-4 days, she's up to it. And she's got a compelling message. And I think she's got a compelling vision. So I don't have any expectations she's not going to be able to nail that. But I imagine that will be something that will take a bit of an adjustment.
It's interesting. You talk about how she's been out there talking about President Joe Biden and not about herself. We're effectively in a position where the campaign has to introduce her or maybe reintroduce her. And they really only have 100 or so days to let the American people know who she is, to get to know each other, if you will, to use really colloquial terms. From your perspective as a communications expert, is it possible to reintroduce a candidate with this short amount of time?
I think so. It's going to be, look, this is not going to be an easy campaign. No one should think that this is going to be a runaway on either side. It's going to be very close. This race has been very close for months and months. Polling this week shows it's a nail biter, both nationally and in battleground states. But she has time. Look, she's raising, you mentioned the 80 million or whatever she raised in 24 hours. She's raised, I think, probably closer to 150 million now since that point, which is only 4 days later, which is a spectacular amount of money on top of the cash on hand they already had. So I fully expect that she's going to have the resources to tell her story, and she's got allies out there who are going to help tell her story as well. So yeah, it's not a lot of time, but look, this is when people are starting to pay attention. So in many respects, that's good for her. And she's got a big moment coming up with the convention where a lot of eyeballs are going to be watching that. And she's going to be able to take advantage of that moment. And I would also say the last 3 or 4 days, the type of earned media that she's gotten, it's hard to put a price tag on that. So that's been super helpful. And I expect, look, the honeymoon is not, these honeymoon periods, they don't always last. So she's going to, start taking incoming from Republicans. We know that's coming. But she has a real important moment with the DNC, and there is no RNC convention, right, to push back on whatever however she portrays herself, which is not good for Republicans. So that big moment that exists right now is for her. And then, you've got 3.5 months to tell your story, both on the ground and then in the airwaves and on social media. And so she can do it. I think she has time, and she's got a great team around her.
You talk about Republican pushback to her candidacy, to her record in office as VP and even as Senator and Attorney General before. And just today, we saw a resolution from House Republicans looking to condemn Vice President Harris's role as so-called border czar under President Biden. And then we have the response from the left saying, well, she was never border czar. What do you make of this? Is denying that she was ever border czar the right political communication strategy?
Well, I think the resolution is a desperate move by Republicans. Remember, they were trying to impeach Joe Biden. I'm not sure whatever happened with that. So a totally desperation move. Look, there was an opportunity to do something about the border a couple of months ago. There was a bipartisan plan that the White House, that the president, the vice president worked on with some of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate. It was ready to go. And the person who stopped it was Donald Trump, because he'd rather have a political issue than solve it. So that's how I think, they should prosecute that matter. Donald Trump was in office for 4 years. He barely did anything on the border except make, I think, things worse. So, I think that resolution was an act of desperation. And I expect that the vice president and her team will, they should go on the offense on sort of talking about what her position is and not let herself get defined by Republicans on that, because look, there was an opportunity to do something on the border very recently with a bipartisan bill, and Trump blocked it.
So I know you say it's politicking for the House to release this resolution, but immigration and the border is a major issue for many voters. If we are still talking about this border czar issue in a week, if we're still engaging in this political tit for tat where Republicans are saying that was her job and Democrats are saying no, it was never her job, is that a good thing if this is still in the news cycle 10, 12, 14, 16 days from now?
Well, Republicans are going to make immigration and the border an issue. They did it in 22. They did it in 20. In both of those elections, they lost. I worked on Senator Mark Kelly's reelect campaign in 22. And one of the things that we did early on was to make sure people understood the senator's position on the border. This issue came up in a special election in New York. Tom Suozzi, which he won against a Republican, and they went after him on the border. And what the now congressman did was got out early and defined his position and talked about it. So I think Democrats can't be scared of this issue. I think they need to make sure their position is clearly defined with voters so they understand it. It's gonna come, right? You're not gonna be able to stop Republicans from launching attack ads on it. But if you have a clearly defined position, and more importantly, you have a solution, then voters will look past it and look at other issues. And we've seen that happen in multiple elections now. So I hope the Harris campaign comes out very strong and clear on what she stands for. I don't think these attacks will ultimately have an impact if they take that route, which is clearly define her position on the border, and then again take the offense on it and make sure that people understand that Republicans had an opportunity to do something on it and Trump got in the way of it.
Now, when we talk about her messaging, one of the things I'm really curious about is the emphasis on her historic achievements as a politician. She has been the first and the only a number of times in her career already to this point, obviously the first female vice president in the United States, poised to potentially become the first female president of the United States. And then, of course, with that comes first woman of color vice president, potential first woman of color president, et cetera, et cetera. But to a certain degree, does that harm her politically? Because not everyone is a first or an only. So does it alienate her from voters if her supporters keep drumming this beat of she's the first, she's historic? And should she lean into another aspect of her identity as she continues to introduce herself or reintroduce herself to voters?
That's a good question. I don't actually hear a lot from the vice president talking about those important milestones. What I hear is other people talking about it. And, if you go back to President Obama and his historic run in 2008, he didn't really talk about the historical nature of his campaign. I just worked for Governor Wes Moore in Maryland, the only black governor in the country, the first black governor in Maryland. And we talked about the issues. And, it's obviously clear, he's black, and other people talked about the historical nature of his candidacy, and other people will talk about the historical nature of her candidacy. I think it's important that she not run away from that by any means, but look, she's talking about the issues, and she's talking about the ways we can bring this country together and solve some big problems that have existed for decades. And I think that's what all voters, regardless of what you look like, want to hear, is solutions and a vision for the future. And that's what I've heard from her for the last 3 days. That's what I expect to hear from her for the duration of the campaign.
Now, obviously, you've worked with Senator Mark Kelly. You just referenced him, and we've been hearing more of his name in the past few days because he's on a few lists suggesting he might be one of the people being vetted to be her second in command, to be her running mate. So, Doug, I'm curious if you were to put on your sorting hat and looking at the potential candidates in the landscape, which include potentially Senator Mark Kelly, who should Vice President Harris pick to be her running mate in this election?
Well, I should say she has a wealth of options, some really talented folks, governors, senators, that are cabinet members that to pick from, which is great, right? Like the Democratic bench is stronger than it's ever been. I would say, look, ultimately it's going to come down to who she's most comfortable with, but I think that at some point, if she wins, which I think she will, she's going to have to govern. So I think you kind of have to look at who's ready to govern with her and be someone who can be a counselor to her and help her through tough situations, right? As her most senior advisor, right? And who's ready to step into the Oval Office if something were to happen. And then I think you look at electorally, who is someone who can bring something to the table and to the campaign. So I would look at those factors in terms of deciding on who the running mate should be. Luckily, she's got a bunch of people out there that would be very, very solid. I'm biased. I think Senator Mark Kelly would be fantastic. He's a combat veteran, flew over 30 missions, an astronaut, a senator, two-term, won twice in a red state, and obviously, along with his wife, Gabby Giffords, has been one of the most vocal advocates for combating gun violence after the terrible assassination attempt on the Congresswoman. So he's got a very compelling story, son of two cops. But look, there are a lot of other people out there as well. I'm sure the vice president is going to make the right choice. But she's got a lot of options, and that's good for her. And it speaks to the future of the Democratic Party.
So obviously, we started this conversation talking about the unprecedented nature of the news we've seen this week. We've never quite seen anything like this in American history. And Doug, you sit as the CEO of a communications firm. So I'm wondering, what are other communications experts saying about all of this? Everything we've seen. What's your take?
Well, look, it's been a whirlwind, to say the least. On Sunday, I think no one was expecting that announcement by the president. And when it happened, I think people were, at least Democrats, and there was a mix of both sadness and shock. Now there's a lot of excitement within the party, excitement that I don't think we've seen in a long time. I would say that, look, people are wondering what it would mean to have a President Kamala Harris, right? Asking about what her positions are, and wondering sort of who's in her inner circle. What is her message going to be during the rest of the campaign? People are wondering what the convention is going to look like. They're going to have to, the convention's in 3 weeks, right? They had a convention built for Joe Biden. They're going to have to change that, right? And so questions about her running mate. And so it's a lot of people are, with Joe Biden, you knew pretty much everything about Joe Biden, right? You knew about his family, he had his running mate. The convention was moving forward the way, with him as the centerpiece. When that all got shook up, I think a lot of people are now wondering, what's it mean to have a Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket? What does she believe? What is she going to fight for? What are the issues? Who's around her? What's the convention going to look like? So it's been interesting. These are crazy times that we live in the last three weeks. Just if you think about the last month since the debate, and it has shook, I think, the entire political world in many different ways. And so I think people are just looking for, especially clients of ours and both, whether it's brands or nonprofits or candidates, are looking for just kind of counsel on, in this uncertain world, how to navigate that. And that's really a lot of what I'm hearing and from clients and from others is just, how do we navigate this, shifting landscape.
I was going to ask also about the down-ballot races, and if your phone is ringing off the hook from some of these congressional or Senate candidates who might need extra communication support, because obviously your job campaigning is a little different if the top of the ticket is Joe Biden versus if the top of the ticket is Kamala Harris. So I imagine all of these races, not just the presidential race, all of these campaign managers are perhaps massaging their messaging. Does that mean more work for someone like you?
Yeah, in some places it does. In some places, maybe not so much. But look, you've got to, it's one thing to have Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. It's obviously another thing to have the vice president. So yes, you have to look at, right now, I'll tell you, and it's been literally 4 days. So right now, what I would say is that, campaigns are starting to reassess their contests. There's going to be polling that is done that looks at the vice president in these districts and Senate states, probably testing messages. And so many of the campaigns I work on, though, there's an emphasis on, what that candidate is going to say and do for the voters in that district or in that state. So, the presidential race is important from sort of from an atmospheric standpoint, but so many of these races come down to the individual candidates. And so, we saw in 22, even with with President Biden having, not the greatest of approval ratings, a lot of Democrats in the House and the Senate and governors were able to navigate what was supposed to be a red wave because they were able to define themselves to voters, have a clear message, and voters sort of, I think, segment out what was going on nationally to make a decision on their own local concerns. This is different. We've got a presidential race, and so we have to figure out what's the impact. And quite frankly, anyone who says that they know right now is lying to you. It takes a little while to figure it out. It's going to take a little while to sort out, right? She doesn't have a running mate. That's going to make a difference. We still need a convention. She hasn't aired one ad yet, right? So all of these things have not happened yet. And so that's one reason why I'm optimistic about her ability to grow. I think her ceiling is higher than Donald Trump's. And once all of those tools that are in her toolbox are being used, I expect her to start, I expect this race to be very close, and then I expect her to win.
Yes, well, there's already been one poll, and it is quite tight, but there are still so many to go. And we hope to bring you back to talk about those polls, to talk about what we see out of the DNC. But in the meantime, Doug Thornell, CEO of SKDK in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Maggie.